So this is a page from the King James Version, 1611, and we're looking at Matthew chapter 5. This is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I'm preaching through the Sermon on the Mount right now, so this is why it caught my attention. And so this one caught my eye because there's a difference here in the King James Version than all the other versions. So the King James Version, I'll just read it here in 3 places. So it's, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill, they be in danger of the judgment, okay? The Gothic script. But that's the phrase there that we're asking about is, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time. Now we have the phrase repeated in verse 27. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. And it goes on to talk about lust, essentially. Actually, I'm preaching on that this week. It's going to be a very interesting week. And then we come down to verse 33. Again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto... Okay, so again, that's the question. The question is, when he says, ye have heard that it's been said by them of old time, okay, that's what the King James Version says, or all of the new translate. I don't even need to go one by one on them because it's across the board. It's to them of old time. So are we talking about by them when he's talking about what's been preaching, right? Or what's being taught? Is it being taught by them or is it being taught to them? And now I had actually set out to, when I was looking at this, when I initially saw it, my thought was like, look, it looks like the King James Version is wrong. And I honestly thought that I was going to go down the path of taking a look at this and finding out that the King James Version here is wrong. But I don't necessarily think that's the case, but it's very complicated. This is a really complicated grammatical issue. And we will tackle that bit by bit. But I want to talk a little bit again about the importance of straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. So again, because this channel is typically focused at textual issues, right, we're going to take a really good look at this. But if your Christian walk is to really, really dive into this thing and just to focus on it to the point where it's just absolute ad nauseum, right, and you're missing the point of the passage, right, don't do that. You're straining out a gnat and you're swallowing a camel. And, and it's really interesting. This is my justification for taking the position that it may not necessarily be the most important part of this passage, right? So if you go to Matthew 23, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the hypocrites, and he says, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law. So I'm coming here, and I understand the New Testament is not the law, but the principle is the same. And it's this, is that if we come here and we avoid, right, we don't take serious the stuff about hating a brother, or the stuff about lusting, or the stuff about forswearing thyself, then we're neglecting the weightier matters. So again, like I said, we're going to talk about this for the next hour or so, but man, if you don't take the command seriously that this whole passage is talking about, you missed it. Now, I took a look at all of the, I don't want to say ancient, but like the older Middle English versions. Should I say Middle English? Man, that's ambiguous in itself. But like the main English ones that have come out that are like pre-modern. So, William Tyndale, Matthew's Bible, Geneva, no particular order, the Bishop's Bible, which is really important because the Bishop's Bible is used as sort of a reference for the King James translation, Coverdale's Bible, Wycliffe's Bible, all of these translations, every single one of them, all of them, they do not have by them of old. They have to them of old, to them of old. And again, when you come over into all of the English Bibles that are like modern, all of them, with the exception of the King James Version, all say to them of old, to them of old. So what is going on here? So for those of you who haven't kind of figured it out, the question goes into the Greek. So what were the King James Version translators doing when they translated that as by those of old? Now, I'm coming with the assumption, that the King James translators are smart men. I think we would all agree with that. Now, they're not beyond error. Okay, I don't believe that. I don't believe that the King James Version is necessarily perfect in every single little bit. There's a possibility of error in there. But I'm going to come to this discussion with the preconceived notion or the presupposition that the translators are very smart men and they knew what they were doing. And this to me would seem like the kind of error that you wouldn't expect for a seasoned right? If we're going to assume this is an error, that it would come from a seasoned translator, someone who's very smart, polyglot, So we'll come to the discussion from that frame of mind. When we take a look at this, we now know that by them of old time is in disagreement with every English Bible translation that is available today. Now, there might be some out there that have some obscure ones or some very not well-known ones that have by them of old, but I don't have them. I haven't seen them. I don't know what they are. So this stands, the KJV translators stand on their own in this passage. So let me pull up a Greek text here. Let's do Scrivener. So here's the verse in question. The one in question here is erethetis archaeos. So it has been said to them or by them of old. Now you'll see here, this is what we call the dative case. So in Greek, a noun can be in one of 5 cases, right? If you count the vocative case. And this specific one is in the dative case. Now, when you are trying to express something that's happening to someone, right, or something that's happening to something, we call that the direct object, right? So in English, if I were to say something like, I hit the ball to my friend, right? I'm swinging, I hit the ball to my friend out in the field. To my friend, he's going to be he's going to be the direct object of the sentence, right? He's the one receiving the action of the verb. So in Greek, when something's receiving the action of a verb, we are putting that in what's called the dative case. Okay, so in this instance, we are looking at, you've heard that it was said to them of old, okay, to the ancient ones or whatever, or in ancient times. It depends on how you want to translate that. But this is in the dative case. So again, the dative case means that it's the direct object of the verb to speak, right? This is past tense verb. It's said to them of old. Now, if that was the case, right, if it was really that simple, right, that's probably how we all learned the dative case, right? When we went to school, we learned you put the to in front of it, and then that's your dative case. You use the keyword and you're good to go. If it were that simple, we wouldn't be here talking about that, because then the King James version, the King James translators would have went to those of old, and then we wouldn't be talking about this today. But see, the thing is the dative case actually acts in a number of different ways. And so the other way that the dative case acts is by something called agency or means. Now, how? These are such big words, it's getting so nerdy. So agency or means often speaks about something with which something happens. So let me make this a little bit more concrete here. So we go back to my example of I hit the ball to my friend. Now we could ask the question, well, what did you hit the ball with? And I would say something like, I hit the ball with my bat. So because the bat is the thing being used to hit the ball, we would put that into the category of means. Right? The bat was the means with which we hit the ball. So if we're using the bat in that way, we would use the dative case. Now, means is always used when it's something that's impersonal. It's a thing, right? Like a baseball bat or a golf club or I hear with these headphones, right? It's impersonal. But then we move into something called agency. We can have the dative of agency. And the dative of agency is essentially the same things as means, except it's something that happens through a person or a personal thing as opposed to a thing itself. The dative of agency would be something like, well, it was spoken by me. Right? Me would be agency. I'm the one who's doing the speaking and I speak it out. So this here, when we come to tous archaeos, by those of old, right? When we use by there, we're actually referencing or we're translating this phrase as though it's the dative of agency as opposed to the direct object. So what we're seeing here is an ambiguity between whether or not we should translate this as a direct object to those of old, or whether we should translate this as a dative of agency by those of old. Right? The question is, why did the King James Version translators use by those of old when everything else has to those of old? So I reached out to a friend of mine. I reached out to Tim Berg, and he's a King James Version historian, and he sent this back to me today, actually. So I asked him if there was any documentation that was provided in some of the recent finds involving the King James translators, or if there's any notes or annotations or anything like that. And he did refer to a document in Bode 1602. And I'm just going to read out what he said. I did get his permission to share this. So let me pull the notes up. And this was his response to my question about BOD 1602. I asked him about, the companies that translated this. So the King James Version was translated. There were a bunch of people grouped up into 6 companies, and the work was kind of divided up between them. And I wanted to know which companies translated Matthew and if they left any notes. So Tim's response was this. He says, the Second Oxford Company worked on the Gospels and Revelation and probably Acts. Several of the lists show that they subdivided so that 4 men primarily worked on the Gospels. George Abbott, later Archbishop of Canterbury. Richard Eads, was it replaced probably by John Agliombi? Giles Thompson and James Montague. Most lists only identify them by titles, namely Dean of Christ Church, Winchester, Worcester, Windsor. So there is some uncertainty about the identity. So we have 4 men who probably worked on Matthew. So the decision to put to or by those of old would have been made by 4 men initially. Okay, initially, it's a complicated process. So they did propose a revision to verse 21. So this is verse 21. Because this is the first in a series of passages which say it was said by them of old, right? Because there's 3 others. To keep it consistent, they would have translated the 3 the same. So when we talk about the first, we're really just talking about all 3 instances of this. So again, in the body of the text, as we see the final King James Version as it was finally translated, we have, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, and then in the footnote here, or to them. Now, what we're saying is originally when those 4 translators from the company, they had this switched. So their recommendation going into finalization was, well, we should have, you have heard that it was said to them of old time, and then we should put in the footnotes or in the marginal notes, we should have by them of old time. Now, at some point in the process, from the time that they finished the work on Matthew 5 to the time that it got finalized, somebody came along and said, no, I think we should switch that. That kind of is interesting because I'm sure whoever switched it, whoever suggested that we should switch it, and of course the guys in the end, I think 12 of them had to agree to whether or not this was good or not. They would have all known that it was going against the grain of what every other English Bible translation would have said before. They had the Bishop's Bible in front of them. I'm sure they were aware of the Geneva. They were aware of Matthew's. They were aware of Coverdale's. They probably had Wycliffe's Bible there and so on and so forth. So this was an intentional decision to change this from to them of old to by them of old. So this wasn't a mistake. This was definitely not a mistake on the part of the translators, at least not an intentional mistake. So what is happening here? What is happening here? We could just go and say, well, every other Bible translation has to them of old, and so every other Bible translator probably right. So we're going to use the majority here, and yeah, I know I'm not a majority text guy, so I'm not being inconsistent here. We could do that, but majorities aren't always right, as we know. My next question is, well, why did they make the decision to change that? Why did they make the decision to change that? So I took a look at some grammars, and again, coming back to the grammar discussion, but again, there's 10 ways in which the verb to speak is used in the same manner as verse 5, 21, 27, 31. Okay, so that's 10 minus those 3, that's 7. So there's 7 other places this verb occurs in that form. So in these examples, we have what I'll call the naked dative. Okay, so there's other ways to express agency in Greek other than a dative case. And in fact, the normal way to express agency in Greek is to use prepositions. Dia. We see dia being used when it says something like, it was said by the prophets that blah, 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 right? By the prophets. It's using dia. Tis prophetes, right? It's using the preposition. But you can also express agency without the preposition. It's just rare. It's rare. According to Dan Wallace, it's rare. And Dan Wallace is the Greek grammarian guide. I took a look at my grammars there, and he says it's rare, but it's possible. And we'll talk a little bit about that because he lays out a couple guidelines for trying to determine whether or not we're using agency here. But you can see here, Matthew 5:33, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old. This is the New King James Version. Hath been said by them of old. Matthew 5:38, you have heard that it was said. And again, there's no direct object. There's nothing. It's just the verb. Matthew 5:33, you have heard that it was said. So almost half of the uses of this verb in this form are from Matthew with this very phrase. So the first half, we can't use them to determine, because those are the ones we're trying to determine, and the two of them don't have any direct objects or anything. So we can't use those two. So now the other 5 are here. So we have erethiafti, it was said to her, it was said unto her. The King James Version goes with to her here. Romans 9:26, again with the dative, with the naked dative, right? No prepositions. Erethiaftis is said, and it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them in the New King James Version, in the place where it was said unto them in the King James Version. So again, they're translating the naked dative as to instead of by, right? Now, where it gets interesting, we come to Revelation 6:11, and it says, then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them, Revelation 6:11, New King James Version, and it was said unto them, same one, okay, maybe it was the other one. And then Revelation 9:4, the last one, and it was said to her, or to her. Oh, none at all. Look at that. It's just those 3 passages. Interesting. So they were commanded not to harm the grass, and it was commanded them that they should not harm the grass. So that's interesting. I don't know why I missed that. I thought there was one in there where they had agency, but there is no agency used. There's no agency used at all. None. Other than those 3 passages. So again, if the King James Version translators are consistently translating that as to, right, the naked dative by itself, no prepositions, translating it as to in every other passage except for these 3, what is going on here? What is going on here? They're obviously smart men. They know what they're doing. They purposely made a decision. This is where we're at so far. They purposely made the decision to reject the reading to them and put to them in the footnote and put by them in the text. So now I took a look at Wallace's grammar, and this is where it gets interesting. So in Wallace's grammar, he gives us 4 kind of ways that we can use to determine whether a specific dative case noun is a dative of agency. So the first one he has is the lexical test. Okay, so is it a noun that references something that's personal? Is it a personal noun? And the answer to this, when we talk about Matthew 5:21, 27, 31, is yes, right? It is personal. So to those who are of old, we're talking about people. So we passed the first lexical test. The second one that Dan Wallace gives us is a contextual question. And he says the person must be portrayed as exercising volition. Okay, and what do we mean? That's a lot of fancy word. So the way I read this is are these people able to make a decision to do something? Okay, that's how I would reference that. Are these people being portrayed as being able to have volition, to make a decision to do something? And they're personal. We're talking about individuals, whether they're teaching, that they would have volition to teach a specific thing, or whether they would even have a volition to obey a certain teaching. So I would say here that this passes the second test, the contextual test. The third one that Wallace gives in his grammar is if it is grammatical. And this is where we kind of run into a little bit of a road bump here. According to Wallace's grammar, he says, the only clear texts involve perfect passive verbs as in the classical idiom. So we get 2 things from this. One is that where we see a dative of agency used, and it's clear that it's a dative of agency, he says that all the clear ones are perfect tense verbs. And he also states that they are a classical idiom. So the dative of agency is something more often seen in classic Greek as opposed to Koine Greek. So this one doesn't really seem to fit because this is an aorist verb. It is not a perfect verb. So what is going on here? Okay, we're going to hold that one. We're going to pause that one, and we're going to move on to the fourth one. The fourth one that Wallace gives us is a linguistic. That is, the agent of a passive verb, this is a passive verb, can become the subject of an active verb. So the passive verb or active verb. So this is passive. It has been said. Verse, if we make it active, it would be someone said. So can we take the direct object, in this case, to those of old? And could we make it an active verb and say, those of old said? Yes, we can do that. So of the 4 out of the 3 criteria the 3 out of the 4 criteria that Wallace gives us to determine if this is a dative of agency, 3 of them pass, all right, and the fourth one doesn't, or the third one doesn't, right? The only clear text involves a perfect passive verb. Now, if the King James translators were able to to go forward in time and look at Wallace's stuff here, this is how I think they would respond, because remember, again, they made a purposeful choice to remove 2 and relegate it to the marginal notes. So I think they would say something along the lines of this. And again, I know I'm just extrapolating from what I've seen so far. I think they would say something like this. They would say, 1, Wallace is only talking about clear texts. In this example, he's only talking about those that are clearly perfect passive verbs. So because it's not a perfect passive verb, it doesn't mean that it's not a dative of agency. It just means that it's not as clear as one that would have been if it was attached to a perfect tense verb. And then, in talking about the classical idiom, there are always references from an older form of the language into a newer form. We all have, most languages tend to hold on to certain features. So let me give you an example. The way we use adjectives, I could say something like, I lived in London, Ontario, right? It's an offshoot of London, England. In London, England, there's the Thames River, and in London, Ontario, there's the Thames River, and we call it the Thames River, right? But on occasion, if we're having a document and it's very formal and stuff, we might switch the adjective to the front instead of to the back, and it might be the River Thames instead of the Thames River. Okay, and that's a feature of older language kind of being attached onto this. So if we're talking about using the dative of agency as a classical idiom, we could suggest that maybe the King James Version translators see that as imposing itself a bit on the Koine language, and that could totally be. The other thing that is potentially possible, again, I'm just answering the question as to why I think the King James Version translators went this direction. The other thing that's possible is, in certain instances, an aorist tense verb can act in such a way that gives a sort of perfect idea. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but my understanding is this is something that can happen. Now, those are the 4 tests. So I would give this like a 3.5, because the grammatical argument, the only clear text involving a perfect passive verb as in the classical idiom, it doesn't necessarily speak to a certainty of something, more like a probability of something. And so there could be something in that off chance. Now, there is another part of the argument that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about the context of the passage. So to give some contextual details of what's happening here, we're in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus is preaching a sermon to those who are listening to him. Obviously, they're listening to him, and he just gets finished preaching the Beatitudes, right? Because he just started his sermon, and then he comes to this passage, and again, this is a prevalent passage in the discussion surrounding preservation, but I'm going to ignore that for now. But in Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus is making a very pointed statement here. And the statement here is that I'm not destroying the law. I'm not doing away with it. I'm not doing away with it. The law is still the law. This is what Jesus is saying. Putting aside the conversation of whether or not we follow the law or not, obviously we live by grace and that kind of stuff. But Jesus is stating here that he's not doing away with the law. Why? Because chances are in his ministry, the scribes and the Pharisees likely came to him and accused him of being antinomian, accused him of replacing the law of Moses and replacing that with something else and totally doing away with it. So he's saying to everybody who's listening to him, listen, I'm not doing this. And then he says, "For verily I say unto you," there we go, "till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." And he says, Whoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So now, an important distinction that we're looking at here is Jesus is talking about two groups of people. One are those who do the commands, and the other are those who teach the commands. And the complaint here specifically that he's stating is essentially that sometimes those who are teaching the commands aren't really doing the commands, and they're going to be seen as least in the kingdom of heaven. But you're seeing this dichotomy already at the start between those who do the commands and those who teach the commands, right? When we talk about our passage in Matthew 5:31, the distinction is between those who teach the command, right? When we say, it has been said by those of old, right? They're teaching, or those who do the commands to those of old. Okay, that's a very important distinction. And then he says, "For I say unto you," right? "For I say unto you," he's saying, I'm not these teachers. I'm not the scribes and Pharisees. They're going to tell you one thing, right? Whether they do what they say or not, who cares? But I'm saying to you, is what Jesus. In fact, if you go into the Greek, I'm willing to bet that I is emphatic. "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." So now he's got the scribes and the Pharisees in a place where they are not entering into the kingdom of heaven. These are the teachers. Remember, these are the teachers. So we come down, and this is the first place where he says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment." But then Jesus says this. He juxtaposes that with, "But I say unto you." But I say unto you. So when Jesus is talking in Matthew 5:21, I think he has the focus on the false teachers, or on the teachers who are teaching but not doing, right? "You have heard that it was said by them of old time," those who taught you before, those who were teaching you in much the same way that the Pharisees are teaching you today. Okay, they say do this. But then he says, but it's not them anymore. It's me. I'm teaching you. See, the juxtaposition between those who are teaching the law before and Jesus expounding on the law now is lost if we use to them, right? That juxtaposition doesn't come out as strong and is in full force. And I think what we see here when we're looking at this passage is that Jesus is really placing himself in, not opposition, but he's placing himself in a much better way, or in a much better place to exposit on the law than those who have exposited before. So the focus is on those of old who were teaching the law, not those of old who were hearing the law. So that's what I think is happening here. That's my way of looking at this. The reading by them of old tends to make more sense with what Jesus is reinforcing in these passages, that he is now the supreme exegete of the law, and he's going to exegete this in a way that gives you the intent of the law, which in this case, right, whoever is angry with his brother, right, don't be angry with your brother. It's the same as murder, right? You go down a little bit further. You know, those who have, you've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. And then Jesus exegetes that further and says, well, don't even have lust in your heart. Don't look at a woman to lust after her, right? And you go down a little bit further. In 31, it's been said, whosoever shall put his wife away, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Or in 33, again, you've heard that it has been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oath. But I say to you, don't swear at all, right? So he's taking the teaching, the exposition of those who went before, and he's comparing it with his own exposition. And he's saying, okay, they said this, but now I'm going to elevate your living. So, or elevate what it is you need to do. So when we look at the context and we take a look at Dan Wallace's 4 grammatical arguments, I'm sure there's other grammars that have ideas in there. And I know, again, they don't necessarily fit that one item perfectly, but it can, right? And you take a look at how Jesus is using this phrase in this passage, I would lean on the side that this is probably going to be, or that we probably should use what the King James Version has put here. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate this point, and it's this, is that the construction, the grammar by itself is ambiguous. It just is. That's how language works. And I think, again, the translators probably use the context to determine that this would be the case. There would have been obviously some deliberation. It went back and forth. Again, we take a look at the evidence of what we saw on Bode 1602, and how they had written down notes to suggest that originally it was going to be the opposite way around, but they did. The other thing to take into account is when you have a footnote in the King James Version. Okay. What that, I believe, says, and Tim said that, again, in my comments, and I'm using Tim because he said I could use his comments in the video, suggested that when a marginal note occurs because of a translation in the margin, right? It's because there's a likelihood that either or could be the proper rendering. So in the mind of the translators, they weren't entirely certain. They don't have that kind of certainty that we look for in which translation should go there. There's sort of like an admission that the translators themselves aren't entirely certain. So they picked what they thought was the best one after some deliberation, some back and forth, and put the reading in the text, but then left the optional. Optional is kind of a bad word to use for optional. I guess I don't know. But they left the potential other translation in the margin. I know some King James Version only positions will be, well, if it's in the body of the text, then that's good enough for me, and we don't care about the margins, and that's fine. That's likely what the King James Version was translating. So with that being said, that's it. For at least for this textual translation issue, we went into the weeds there. We did go a lot into the grammatical weeds. I hope you found it helpful. If you're still in the chat, let me know. Did you find that helpful? Do you think that the King James Version translators putting by them of old time in there was a good choice on their part? Or do you think to them of old time should remain in the scriptures? What do you think? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.